The story begins with the sound of an old clock ticking in the quiet Philadelphia Heritage Museum. The sound echoed softly in the big room, which was full of old, mysterious things. That night, the museum was almost empty, with only 2 college students working late. Around them were dusty wooden boxes brought from a locked storage room. Jack, a history student, sat at a desk, staring at his laptop. He looked very tired. His coffee, cold for hours, sat beside him, but it didn't help him stay awake. Jack was used to doing boring work, but tonight felt harder. Maybe it was because there was so much to do, or maybe because the museum felt a little spooky. Jesse, his friend, was much more excited. Jesse always seemed full of energy, even when the job was boring. Jesse carried a pile of books from an old shelf, but instead of working, Jesse started looking around. In the corner of the room, there was a big wooden box with the word private carved on it. Jesse's eyes lit up with curiosity, like a kid who found a secret toy. Jesse leaned in closer to look at the box. When the lid was opened, a strong smell of old wood and burnt metal filled the air. Inside the box was an antique radio. Even though it looked worn out from age, it still seemed special. Beautiful carvings covered the outside, making it look like more than just an ordinary radio. Jesse, amazed, carefully picked up the radio. It felt like the radio was calling to Jesse, pulling Jesse closer. The carvings on it seemed mysterious, like they were hiding a secret. Jack had been watching from a distance, but now Jack stood up. Jack looked at the radio with a curious but doubtful expression. Jack was more interested in its history than the strange feeling it gave off. But before they could decide what to do with it, they heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. And Henry, the museum's night guard, appeared with a serious look on his face. His eyes went straight to the radio in Jesse's hands, narrowing sharply. Without saying much, Henry motioned for them to put the radio back in the box. He told them it wasn't something they should touch. The way Henry spoke made the room feel colder even than the chilly night air sneaking through the cracks in the old museum walls. Soon after, Jack sat back down at his desk, trying to focus on his laptop screen. But his mind kept wandering to the old box and the strange radio they had just found. Henry had left a few minutes ago, but the room still felt weird. There was something about the way Henry spoke, like his serious tone, or his sharp look, that left the air feeling heavy and uneasy. In the corner of the room, Jesse turned on the flashlight on the phone and started examining the bottom of the radio. Jesse couldn't stop staring at it. There was something about the carvings that was so interesting. They looked like symbols or maybe an old alphabet, but they were too fancy to figure out. Jesse gently tapped the wooden part of the radio. It made a hollow sound, like it was empty. But then Jesse twisted one of the big knobs on the side of the radio. That's when something strange happened. The radio suddenly turned on even though it wasn't plugged in. A soft sound came from the speaker, like a whisper from far away in a dark hallway. Faint jazz music crackled through the static, making it feel like something out of a dream. Then, out of nowhere, a woman's voice spoke, saying, "Help me. I'm here. Don't leave me." Jesse froze, feeling a chill run down the back. The voice kept coming from the radio, but the words were getting harder to understand. The woman's soft plea turned into heartbreaking sobs. For a moment, it felt like she was talking directly to Jesse, begging to be heard. Jesse, at the time, Jack's voice snapped Jesse out of the strange moment. Jesse turned, looking confused. "What are you doing?" Jack asked sharply, walking over to Jesse. Jesse pointed at the radio. But as Jack got closer, the sound from the radio stopped. It was completely silent now, as if nothing had ever happened. The only thing left was the soft glow from Jesse's flashlight shining on the wooden surface. Jack gave Jesse a suspicious look. Are you trying to scare me? Jack asked. No, I'm serious, Jesse said, sounding worried. I heard a voice. A woman. She was asking for help. I'm sure of it. Jack sighed, trying to stay calm. The radio is probably just broken. Maybe something inside it still works, like an old capacitor or something. Don't overthink it, Jack said. But Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was real. Determined to figure it out, Jesse pulled out the phone and tried to take a picture of the carvings on the radio. Maybe later, Jesse could look them up online. But when Jesse opened the camera app, the screen suddenly went black. A moment later, it flickered back on with an error message saying cannot take picture. Object not recognized. There, Jesse frowned and tried again, but the same thing happened. The phone camera worked perfectly when pointed at other things, but every time Jesse tried to take a picture of the radio, the same error appeared. Jack noticed Jesse fiddling with the phone and shook his head. Jack didn't seem impressed. You're getting too obsessed, Jesse. We have a lot of work to finish before morning, Jack said. But Jesse couldn't stop thinking about what just happened. Putting the phone away, Jesse still felt uneasy. Something about the radio wasn't right caused something that didn't belong there. Jesse took a deep breath, trying to shake off the strange feeling. The woman's voice still echoed in Jesse's mind, even though the radio was now silent. The flashlight from the phone wobbled slightly, casting a strange shimmer on the radio's carved wooden surface. As Jesse stared at the carvings on the radio, something strange happened. His vision started to blur, like the world around him was shifting. The air felt cold, and suddenly, shadows flashed before his eyes, and it's quick, unclear images that were hard to understand. He saw a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and filled with tears. Her messy black hair looked like she had been running from something. Everything around her was dark, except for a faint glow from an old-fashioned chandelier. The woman tried to scream, but the only sound was a silent, deafening echo. Then the scene changed. The woman fell to the ground, reaching out as if begging for help. Behind her stood a tall figure, just a shadowy silhouette holding something sharp. The next moment happened too fast that a streak of red flashed across Jesse's vision. Jesse gasped and stumbled backward, taking a deep breath. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead. In an instant, everything was back to normal. The room lights were steady, and the shadows were gone, as if nothing had happened. But Jesse knew what he had seen or felt. Jack frowned, watching him. "What's wrong with you?" Jack asked. Jesse didn't answer. His hands trembled as he gripped his phone tightly. There was something about the radio, something that didn't just speak but also showed terrifying things. Jesse didn't know what it all meant, but one thing was clear, that this wasn't an ordinary object. The museum's archive room felt like a completely different world. There were no windows, just rows of metal shelves filled with dusty folders, old documents, and yellowed newspapers sealed in plastic. Jack typed quickly on his laptop, trying to find something in the digital catalog to make the search easier. Meanwhile, Jesse rummaged through piles of folders, sneezing now and then as dust filled the air. The antique radio sat silently on the table in the middle of the room. It looked like an ordinary old object now, but the room felt heavier, as if the radio's presence made the air thick and uneasy. As Jesse dug through the folders, something caught the eye, and it's a small leather-bound notebook. It was small but surprisingly heavy. In the corner of the cover, a handwritten label, storage collection, unidentified item. Soon after, Jesse opened it and froze. Inside, tucked between the pages, was an old black and white photograph. The picture showed a young woman with neatly curled hair, swept to one side. She wore a shimmering dress that sparkled like stars in the night sky. At the bottom of the photo was a name, Margaret Hensley. The name was written under the photo, along with a date February 15th, 1932. Jesse stared at the woman's face longer than expected. There was something oddly familiar, or maybe a little spooky about her eyes. It felt like Jesse had seen her before, even though that seemed impossible. "Jack, look at this," Jesse said. Jack, busy with the digital catalog, looked up. He took the notebook from Jesse's hands and quickly read through it. The handwriting was messy, but one part stood out saying Margaret Hensley, a popular nightclub singer during Prohibition, mysteriously disappeared after a series of murders near the theater district. Jack kept reading, finding more details about Margaret's life. She had been a famous jazz singer in Philadelphia during the 1920s, a rising star in tough times. But her career wasn't without drama. Rumors swirled about her connections to several wealthy men who often visited her club. "Here it is," Jack said, pointing to a small note at the corner of the page. The radio was a gift from a secret admirer. Jesse glanced at the note, curiosity growing stronger. There, a brief description mentioned that the radio had appeared in Margaret's life a few months before she vanished. No one knew who had given it to her, but it was called an inappropriate gift for a nightclub singer. Inappropriate gift? Jesse muttered, repeating the words in his head. Jack kept searching the digital catalog and finally found something more detailed. "Listen to this," he said. The radio is an Ecotone Deluxe, one of the most advanced models from the 1930s. Only a few were made, and most were bought by very rich people. "So, it's not just an ordinary radio," Jesse whispered, still thinking about Margaret's photo. Jack nodded, "And I think whoever gave it to her knew exactly what they were doing. If we can figure out who the secret admirer was, we might learn more about this radio." As Jack went back to his laptop, Jesse couldn't stop staring at Margaret's photo. This time, the woman's eyes seemed even more real, like she was trying to tell him something. It didn't feel like just a picture anymore. The archive room felt heavier, almost eerie. The radio, sitting silently on the table, seemed like it was watching them, a silent third presence in the room. Jesse kept turning the notebook over in his hands, studying every detail he might have missed. Meanwhile, Jack busily created a list of things to search for, hoping to find more clues about Margaret Hensley. A few minutes passed in silence. Then, Jack found an old local newspaper from 1932 with the headline "Margaret Hensley's Disappearance Shocks Philadelphia." The article explained that Margaret was last seen on Valentine's Day in 1932 at the nightclub where she performed, Lune Noir. A witness said she received a large box backstage, which was believed to contain the antique radio. A few hours later, she left with an unknown man and was never seen again. Jesse read the article carefully, holding his breath. A large box? It had to be the radio. But who was the mysterious man? Jack kept scrolling through the digital archive and found more articles. These connected Margaret to a series of murders near the theater district in the months before she disappeared. All the victims were men rumored to have ties to Margaret, but there wasn't enough evidence to prove she was involved. Someone was trying to protect her, Jack muttered, almost to himself. Or maybe they were hiding something about her. Jesse nodded, but his mind started to wander. His eyes fixed on the radio, and the longer he stared, the more he felt the woman's voice coming back. It wasn't a real sound, but more like an echo in his head, which a memory that didn't feel like his own. When Jesse closed his eyes for a moment, vivid images filled his mind. He saw the nightclub Lune Noir with dim red and purple lights glowing softly. The smell of drinks and smoke seemed to linger in the air. On the stage stood Margaret, wearing a shiny silver dress. Her voice was gentle yet powerful, capturing the attention of everyone in the room. Then, a man appeared. His figure was hard to see clearly, like a blurry shadow, but Jesse could feel how serious and heavy his presence was. The man was holding a big box with fancy carvings, and it's the same kind of box that held the radio they found. The way the man looked at Margaret felt strange and scary, like he was too focused on her in a way that didn't feel right. Jesse. Jack's voice snapped him out of the vision. Jesse blinked, his eyes wide and his breathing quick, as if he had just woken up from a bad dream. Jack looked at him with concern. "Are you okay?" Jesse nodded slowly, but his hands were shaking. He glanced at the radio again. Was it just his imagination? Or was the radio really showing him something? And Jack, who didn't seem to notice Jesse's unease, kept reading. This time, he found a note from a former owner of the Luna Noir nightclub. In an interview from the 1940s, the man mentioned that Margaret often received gifts from fans, but one gift frightened her, and it's an antique radio with a message engraved on it. Jack read the note aloud. "Listen to me. Hear my truth." The message was carved on the bottom of the radio, and according to the man, Margaret changed after she received it. She became quieter, often talked to herself, and was sometimes seen crying in the corner of the stage after her performances. "I think this radio had a big role in what happened to Margaret," Jack said, staring at the radio suspiciously. Jesse didn't respond. He was still lost in his thoughts, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. But one thing was becoming clear, that this radio wasn't just an old object. It was a silent witness to something darker, something hidden beneath the surface of history. At that moment, Jesse stayed quiet, still thinking hard about what he had seen. It didn't make sense, but one thing felt true, that the radio wasn't just an old object. It seemed to hold a dark secret, something hidden from the past. Jack didn't want to waste any time, so he went back to searching the museum's digital files. This time, he looked for more information about the people who owned the radio before. After some searching, he found a note written by someone who used to work at the museum. "This Ecotone radio is very special, but nobody owned it for long. Every person who had it experienced something bad, like dying suddenly, losing all their money, or disappearing. It's not just an old object from history, and it seems to bring bad luck." Jack read the note with a serious look. He found a list of people who owned the radio, and it's a rich businessman who lost all his money in one night, a mother who disappeared with her 2 kids, an artist who was found dead in their studio, and finally, Margaret Hensley. "This can't just be an accident," Jack said quietly, almost whispering. Jesse held the photo of Margaret, his eyes full of questions. Before he could say anything, the lights in the archive room flickered a few times. Then, a soft clicking sound came from the radio. It turned on again, even though no one had touched it. The woman's voice returned, clearer than before, saying, "Listen to me." The museum felt even quieter than usual. Only the steady ticking of an old clock echoed through the main hallway, a reminder of time passing. Jack was busy looking through more documents on the computer, while Jesse felt his chest tighten. The radio sat silently on the archive table, but it seemed to drain the warmth from the room, leaving behind a cold, eerie feeling. Jesse couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. Her face, just like in the photo, was stuck in his mind. But it wasn't just the photo that troubled him. It was the voice from the radio and the image of the man with the large box that haunted his thoughts. At that moment, Jesse felt like he needed to leave the archive room. Grabbing his phone, he pretended to check something. "I need some fresh air," he mumbled to Jack. Jack didn't look up and just nodded. When Jesse opened the archive room door, a chill from the museum hallway greeted him. The old yellow lights on the ceiling lit up the long corridor, but shadows at the far end seemed to shift, like something was waiting there. He started walking faster, feeling as if someone was watching him. The air grew colder, and the wooden floor creaked under his steps. But it wasn't just his footsteps, cause there was another faint creaking sound behind him. He stopped, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned around. The hallway was empty, with only shadows from the lights dancing on the walls. Jesse swallowed hard. "It's just my imagination," he whispered to himself. Turning back, he kept walking, but the sound of footsteps returned, this time closer. He spun around quickly. Again, nothing. At the end of the hallway, a shadowy figure appeared. It was a tall man with broad shoulders, standing still in the dark. Jesse's chest tightened as he stared at the figure, trying to see more clearly, but the dim lights made it hard to make out the man's face. "Henry," Jesse whispered, but his voice was barely audible. The figure didn't move. Jesse tried to calm himself. It had to be Henry, the museum guard, but why wasn't he saying anything? The man took a small step forward, and Jesse instinctively stepped back, bumping into the wall. His phone almost slipped from his hand. Slowly, the figure stepped into the light. It was Henry. The old man stared at Jesse without any emotion, but there was something strange in his eyes. It's an emptiness, or maybe something darker. "Why are you here?" Henry's voice was low and heavy, almost like a growl. Jesse swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. I just needed some fresh air," he said. Henry didn't reply. He just stood there, staring at Jesse with an intense look that made him feel uneasy. In the strange silence, Jesse felt like Henry was judging him with his eyes. "I know what you're doing," Henry finally said, his voice low and rough, almost a whisper. Jesse frowned. "What do you mean?" "The radio," Henry said, his footsteps sounding heavier as he walked closer. "That thing will destroy you if you don't stop. I've seen it before many times." Henry was now standing very close. His stare made the air around them feel colder. "Ask yourself," Henry continued, his voice even lower. "Are you sure you want to know the truth? Because the truth can kill." Jesse couldn't say a word. His body felt frozen, like he couldn't move. Henry stared at him for a few seconds longer, then turned and walked away, his steps fading into the darkness of the hallway. Shortly after, Jesse let out a quiet sob, suddenly realizing how fast he was breathing. As he walked back to the archive room, his mind replayed everything that had just happened. Henry's words, "I've seen it before," felt more like a warning. But those words mixed with the voice of the woman from the radio that still echoed in his head, saying he's too close. "He knows everything about me. Don't let him come near." Jesse gripped his phone tightly. The woman's voice now felt like it was trying to warn him. But who was she talking about? The museum hallway felt heavy, like the air was too thick to breathe. Jesse and Jack returned to the archive room, only to find the radio turning itself on again. This time, there were no cries. Instead, a soft jazz tune began to play, its gentle melody filling the room. The music sounded calming at first, but there was something sad, hidden deep in the notes. Soon after, Jack walked over to the table and tried to turn off the radio, but none of the buttons worked. He shook it gently, his frustration growing. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them. Jesse spun around quickly, and there was Henry, standing in the doorway. His sharp eyes were locked on them. "Give me the radio," he said flatly, but his voice carried a threatening tone. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? Why do you want the radio?" he asked. Henry didn't answer. He stepped closer, his body tense, like a wild animal ready to pounce. "You don't know what you're messing with," Henry said. "The radio needs to be returned. Margaret, she doesn't want you involved." Then Jesse started to step back slowly, but Henry was faster. He lunged toward the table, reaching for the radio. Jack grabbed Henry's arm, trying to stop him, but Henry's strength was far greater than they expected for an old man. Moments later, The room erupted into chaos. Papers and files flew everywhere as they struggled in the cramped space. Henry shoved Jack to the floor, but Jesse quickly grabbed the radio and tried to keep it away from Henry. Then something made Jack freeze. During the scuffle, Henry's sleeve rolled up, revealing a tattoo on his wrinkled arm. It was the name Margaret, written in a fancy Art Deco style and surrounded by a flower design. Jack's eyes widened as he recognized the tattoo. His mind raced back to an article he had read earlier, one that mentioned Margaret's secret admirer had a tattoo of her name on his arm. It was said to be a sign of devotion, but no one ever knew who the admirer was. "Henry, it's you," Jack said quietly, but his voice was steady with certainty. Henry paused, breathing heavily. His eyes met Jack's, and for a moment, something in him seemed to break like someone tired of hiding the truth for too long. "I loved her," Henry said at last, his voice rough and full of emotion. "She was everything to me, but no one would let us be together. Quincy." He took a deep, shaky breath, as if the memory was too much to bear. Quincy knew. He wouldn't let Margaret leave, especially not with me. There, Jesse held the radio tightly, staring at Henry with a confused look. "Are you saying Quincy killed her?" Jesse asked. Henry lowered his head, his voice trembling. "I don't know for sure. I wasn't there when it happened. Margaret wanted to run away that night, but I was late. When I got there, all I found was her dress on the stage, covered in blood." He swallowed hard, his eyes shiny with unshed tears. "But I know Quincy had a reason to stop her. He owned the club, and Margaret was his biggest star. He wouldn't let anyone take her away." Before Jesse could respond, Margaret's voice filled the room again. This time, she was singing the same song, but it sounded darker, more haunting, like a cry from another world. The melody carried a deep sadness that sent chills down their spines. "He's lying," the voice whispered between the lines of the song. Jack and Jesse exchanged worried glances, unsure of what to do. "He's hiding the truth." Henry stepped back slowly, his face turning pale. "Margaret, I only wanted to protect you," he murmured, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. Jack felt his body tense up. Who was Margaret really talking about? Was Henry truly innocent? Or was this her way of revealing his betrayal? When the song stopped, the radio went silent again, but the air in the room felt heavier than before. Without saying a word, Henry turned and walked away, leaving Jack and Jesse confused and uneasy. The radio sat on the table, its faint glow making it look like it was waiting to reveal another secret. Morning slowly crept into the Philadelphia Heritage Museum. The first rays of sunlight shone through the large windows, but the inside of the museum still felt cold and gloomy. Jack and Jesse sat in the main room, looking tired and puzzled after the strange and chaotic night. The antique radio, now appearing like just an ordinary object, rested on the table in front of them. "Henry's gone," Jesse said softly, almost as if speaking to himself. "I looked everywhere in the hallways, storage rooms, even his office. He just disappeared." Jack glared at the radio with frustration. "He knows something. That's why he left. But this radio, this thing, is the real problem." They had tried everything from kicking it, smashing it on the floor, even hitting it with a wooden stick from the archive room. But the radio remained untouched, without a single scratch. It was as if it wasn't made from normal materials, but something stronger or worse, something alive. Jesse closed his eyes, still hearing Margaret's haunting voice in his mind. The eerie song and her mysterious message made his chest feel heavy. There was something they didn't understand, but he wasn't sure if he even wanted to know more. "So, what do we do now?" Jesse finally asked. Jack turned to him, with a determined look. "We give it to Mr. Grayson. He's the museum curator. If anyone knows what to do with something like this, it's him." Mr. Grayson arrived half an hour later, calm as always, with a small, unreadable smile. When Jack and Jesse handed him the radio, he stared at it for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "You've made the right choice," he said in a steady voice. "Some objects are better kept with someone who knows how to handle them." Jack felt relieved, though a small part of him still wasn't sure. Jesse, on the other hand, simply nodded silently. Something about the whole situation made him uneasy, but he couldn't explain what it was. After taking the radio, Mr. Grayson walked down a long, rarely used hallway to a door at the very end. But instead of destroying the radio, as Jack and Jesse might have imagined, Grayson carried it to a large metal door. He entered a complicated code, unlocking it, and stepped into a hidden room. The room was huge and filled with shelves holding strange and mysterious objects. A cracked mirror, a porcelain doll with a creepy smile, a small wooden box covered in unknown symbols, and dozens of other items that seemed just as cursed as the radio. Grayson placed the radio on an empty shelf, pausing to look at it with his usual thin smile. "One more," he murmured, as if talking to himself. "There's always one more." He turned off the lights, leaving the room in complete darkness. On the shelf, the tiny light on the radio flickered softly, as though it was alive, before going out completely.
Sun shines bright, and the snow it falls